What's he building in there? What's he building in there? We have a right to know.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 23 of Reframing the Narrative, and I'm super excited to be back at this in live time with my awesome co-host, DJ. DJ, so good to see you again, and just really stoked to introduce this new mini-series that we're going to introduce to you. It's called Narratives from Age to Age and Coast to Coast. So much to talk about since Jake and I have had our own time away. You may have seen our more recent episodes, but those were all pre-recorded. Now we're back at it, revitalized and ready to go. So without further ado, Jake, you were just in Europe all over the place. You've seen a lot of things. I think you've got some initial thoughts to kick us off in this age to age and coast to coast discussion. So, Jake, take it away.
Right. Well, thanks for that intro, PJ, and it's good to be back. It does feel like a really long time. I think we've either aged or we've reverse aged over this time, depending on how our travels may have affected us. So, one thing traveling in Europe that really struck me was this whole idea of just the definition of ages and eras and defining them as either good, as in the Enlightenment, or dark and bad, as in the medieval or Middle Age or Dark Ages period. And since I am a contrarian and you fall into that camp, that's why we're here, is to look at things that are kind of packaged for us and sold and described in certain ways, and then it's handed down and we're taught that, and that's what we're supposed to just regurgitate. So one thing that came on really strong in an underground tour of Prague, for instance, was just that everything was set up because of the constant threat of invasion, the pestilence. You had to be mindful of people coming to your door and drawing your swords before they did, or being conscripted for some marauding army, and that was the life at the time. It could be totally true. I wasn't there, put it that way. So we don't know. Just things that happened yesterday. We don't know how they really went down unless we were there. And so I think we'll get into it. But we'll fast forward to current events as well. But that just got me thinking. Maybe the Dark Ages are defined that way for a reason, because it's opposite day all the time in the world that we're in this world of deception. And so that was kind of my thinking as far as this topic goes, and we can kind of fast forward to more current topics as well. How about you and your travels? I understand you switched coasts for a little while.
I did, but I just want to comment on your introduction there, and anyone who's been in the research game for any significant period of time knows that the quote unquote powers to be, or the Freemasons and their handlers and controllers, we're all aware that the fact is everything goes by inversion. That's the name of the game. And when it comes to our history, which there's the famous quote attributed to Napoleon that history is a set of lies agreed upon. And whether he actually said that or someone else did, it doesn't matter because it is true. And the, Freemason credo of as above, so below, inversion on everything. You bring up a really good point about the Dark Ages, and I'm convinced that they weren't dark. In fact, they were, this idea that 1,000 or more years went by and nothing really happened and everything was primitive, and people sort of digressed from their human progress. I think that's a cover for the millennial reign that came and went, and that actually when things were handed over and the little season kicked off, I'll say roughly in the 1800s. I don't really know. There's many thoughts about that. But then, this new age of enlightenment was actually the age of deception. And that's what we've been dealing with. And as a community, for us to start pulling on these threads and saying what's actually happening, what's behind the scenes, that's covering every little bit of the tapestry of this little season of deception. And I can totally see, you were in Prague and you saw some of that old world architecture. I wish I had known what I did when I was there. I think it was 2013 that I was in Prague, and I was Joe Q normie at the time. Still fascinated by the architecture that I saw, but I never really thought like this was one of the few untouched parts of the world where that architecture was there to be seen and witnessed, and not covered up or bombed away to erase our true history. And I'd love to hear more observations about what you saw there, because I do really think that there's so much about our history that's hidden. In fact, this, not to open a rabbit hole and go down it too deeply, but I'm also convinced that the Roman civilization extended far beyond Italy and the immediate areas of Europe. And when you look at the founding of the U.S., that I'm not even sure that those people were given as characters were real, or maybe they were conscripted. But when we look at the buildings in DC and other parts of the US and the world, those really, to me, smack as Roman architecture, that Rome really covered the entire world for the most part. And that's something that simply isn't talked about in our history, which, as we know, there's many hundreds or thousands of years that have been made up. And look at the work of Alatoni Flamenco and Gunnar Heinsohn and others, who've shown that a lot of this has been made up. And in fact, I'm starting to reach the conclusion that much of that made up history was from some form of AI that we can't understand now, but maybe is slowly being introduced through technology. My lunch break is a perfect example of a content creator who's uncovered some of these overlapping and redundant stories that make no sense. But all that is to say that history is fabricated, and there is that inversion that, as you say, dark ages, were they really dark? I don't think so. And I'll get into some of my travels and observations, but I just wanted to tee it up and then toss it back over the net to you to give us some more observations of what you saw of old world architecture, and what were some of the things that really stood out to you.
Well, just getting into the timeline, I wonder if we're actually missing a period of time, several centuries, or even up to a millennium. If that is just a cover, the Dark Ages is just a cover story for saying, yeah, everything sucked. It was just brutal. No, there was nothing enlightening or uplifting about that era at all. So let's just write it off as being just brutal and terrible. And then when our current controllers came in, you can almost align the Enlightenment with the germination of Freemasonry. So they ascribe to this, and it's just hyped up as this is the Enlightenment. And so if they're so good, then everything before that must have been so bad. And that gets into this whole duality thing that they love to play off. And that's the Hegelian dialectic in a philosophical kind of way. But what struck me, and the reason why this is top of mind as I'm digesting and kind of just going through and ruminating over what I observed and experienced in Europe, was this overwhelming thought, like, why would all this glorious, magnificent architecture, these spaces where we know, if you mentioned my lunch break, it's all connected to energy in some way. would this exist if only the super elite could avail themselves of it? That's quite possible. I think maybe just people suck, and when they get in power, they just don't want to share anything with anybody else. It's quite possible that you had wall cities and you had slaves working the cities, just like you have, you know, people enjoying themselves at Starbucks. Everyone else is working for the people that ordered their latte. So you have people within a wall city, and you the ones enjoying it and the ones doing the slave work. That is possible, but on some level, and I am kind of intuitive, I'm just thinking, no, I think there was a period of time where most of the people were able to walk into a cathedral and there was something special going on there. There was some kind of energy. Maybe there were even dirigibles, anchoring at on the spires. I don't know, but and that's something I'm out of my depth talking about it at the moment. But on an intuitive level, that just struck me as another example of everything being handed to us as kind of being upside down, and as a result of that, I want to investigate it further.
Absolutely. And, I think that ties to a lot of what's going on in our current age and some of the political theater that we've been witness to on many coasts. And again, apologies, Jake. I'm gonna punt the ball back to you here in a second because you had mentioned something to me off air about some of the people you spoke to in Germany and their fears about being pulled into a conflict. Maybe tell us something about that because I feel like there's a lot of threads that connect in some way in this discussion, and just maybe share those observations with the audience, as well as you had also mentioned to me about some of the gun ownership
Mm.
information that you gained over there. I'd be interested to hear more about that, and I think our audience would too.
Okay, well, first, the gun ownership aspect was brought up during just a gathering, and um, something, the Second Amendment being something that we point to as one of the features or advantages of the American system came up. And then somebody who had been living in Europe, they're not European themselves, but they had been living there for a couple of decades, said, well, did you know that Swiss and Austrian gun ownership is actually higher per capita than in America? And that just blew the minds of some of the people present there, because it's kind of like, in some cases, like America, our our media is always hyping sex, right? Sex and violence, all this kind of stuff. So an outsider's view is like, wow, Americans are like super sexual. They're really free and open about sex and stuff like that. Meanwhile, if you go and you live around the rest of the world, sex is like, this is a completely different topic, but it's kind of the same way. They just they do it, they do it a lot, and they don't talk about it. And so I'm thinking gun ownership in Europe is kind of the same thing. Like, and we know that in Switzerland, basically, you're almost required to own a firearm as long as you're you're considered fit to, because all males serve in the Swiss army, and the Swiss military, I should say, because we don't want people thinking just of knives. And um, then they maintain their training and they continue to own their firearms. And I was surprised to find out that in Austria as well, it's kind of a similar situation, although I don't believe they have mandatory military service. They just own a lot of guns. And so I thought that was really interesting to find out. So one thing that I think in America that we may overlook when we're looking at things like this Ukraine, um, this situation there with Russia and Ukraine, is it seems so far away for us. It seems like, oh, this is just something that kind of it's a domestic policy issue, as far as like sending money over there when we should be repairing our roads and bridges, and we should be working on, a mainstream opinion, but healthcare and schools, things like that. Meanwhile, in Europe, their take is it's very close to them. It's the same continent. It's not far away. And in Germany, where I also spent some time, the topic came up of perhaps forced conscription into the military if the bad boy Putin does anything further, and or maybe the right false flag or the right trigger is is activated, and we're off to the races. And the Germans, of course, have a certain very, I would say, also kind of like a false memory syndrome as far as like the current generations of Germans go. But they've been indoctrinated into having certain views of war and their role in past conflicts. So it's something, and for good reason, they don't want to get dragged into. And that's very top of mind. So just being in Europe, it's a different vibe on many levels as far as the architecture, the just social interactions. On a weekday afternoon, late in the afternoon, the sun's going down at 9 o'clock, and young people in Prague are just hanging out at cafes. It looks like a weekend in any city in the US, if that. I think it's probably more active on a Wednesday, Thursday night in Prague. Just people out doing stuff. It's absolutely wonderful. I really enjoyed that. It's not just young people, but it did have a young vibe. And then as far as like what's on their minds, they also have that kind of weight holding them down. Of course, we always have to have tension for the rulers to run things. So that's just a few observations about that kind of duality going on there as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Ukraine conflict, and I saw something recently. It may have been earlier this week, but it was on one of the JT's mixtapes episode. They talked about all of the different tunnels and catacombs that exist in the world, and I hadn't realized this before watching this episode, that Ukraine itself holds probably the biggest set of catacombs in the world. We're talking about many kilometers, something that dwarfs the one that everyone knows about in Paris. And it really makes me think about what the true motivation of the conflict over there is. Now, I'm not saying it's the sole reason, but it could be an added perk. Anyone who's looked into this closely will realize that there are a lot of moneyed interests making money on whatever is going on over there, if in fact much is really going on at all, really referring to green screen, mainstream media fakery, and we never really know the true extent of what's actually happening on the ground versus what's pumped through the black box in everyone's living room. But that being said, I think about one of the big conflicts in the 1900s, WW2, if you will, where there's a lot of speculation about what really may or may not have happened, and that perhaps one of the motivations was to erase old world structures through bombing regimes. I think that's entirely possible. And of course, there are multiple motivations for any of these conflicts. I definitely subscribe to the notion that any war is a banker's war, and I think it goes much further than that as well. But that is to say that perhaps part of the Ukrainian struggle is to, if there are bombings over there that happen or intensify, maybe there is an aspect of erasing some of that hidden history. And why I think that's important, I'd never really thought about it until watching that particular mixtape episode. But if you think about the catacombs, it's really staring everyone in the face saying, how did this get here? Really think about that. So, the narrative we've been given is that there was a bunch of disease, they ran out of places to bury people, and then they just started putting all these bones down beneath the cellars, and that was that. But the story doesn't actually match up when you look at the bones and how intricately they are assembled artistically, proudly. Beyond that, think about what would be involved. Let's say that there were hundreds of dead people laying all over the place. What would you have to do to get all those bones arranged in that manner? Well, you'd have to figure out a way to strip it all of the flesh and everything that was part of the decaying process. How do you think that happened? Really think about that for a second. To me, I think that's one more piece of evidence that most people haven't thought of a past Armageddon and perhaps fire melting and resetting things. How else could you clean the bones so cleanly and then perhaps afterwards start stacking them in the arrangements we see in the Paris catacombs and other parts of the world? To me, that's a narrative worth really re-examining and thinking about. So I bring this all back full circle to Ukraine because I wasn't aware that they house these massive catacombs that really dwarf what is in Paris. And that's something to think about. So, okay, we've got the narrative in Paris that there was all this disease, they ran out of places to put people. How do you account for the rest of the catacombs throughout the world? What story is that really telling us? I would give that to you, Jake, to maybe comment on, but also I'd have our audience really think about that. And if they have other explanations, we'd love to hear them in the comments and start a conversation. But I had never really thought about it before of what that those bones are really trying to tell us. What story is there that we're missing?
Well, before I comment, do you know anything about the official story or the justification for the catacombs in Ukraine? What what's the interpretation of that? Because we know about like you said, the Paris catacombs was mass pestilence essentially. What about Ukraine?
That's something that I'll have to research and maybe we bring back to the next installment of this conversation. So I'll confess ignorance on that. But if I had to venture a guess, it's probably a similar story. The old dark ages, everyone was dying. They had not enough room to put everyone. And in fact, I actually want to add another aspect to this conversation too. And I think it was a really good point that they talked about on the mixtape is there was a TikTok video recently that had been put out where someone was talking about the number of people just in the US who supposedly are here, and for the average death rate, how many people would have to die per day, and comparing that to the total sum number of grave sites in all of the US, there is a big mismatch in terms of population, death rate, and where all those bodies go. So that actually adds another element to this conversation as well, in terms of not only are we given false narratives and false timelines, but the population itself is a big question. And perhaps the catacombs are telling us a story there too, that perhaps the population was much bigger than what we were led to believe, and those bones are trying to tell us a story.
Yeah, that definitely brings up an area that I've given some thought to, but not enough research either, which is just we're given this idea that because of the progress of human civilization since that time of the Enlightenment, and especially since the Industrial Revolution, we just had this linear and then beyond linear logarithmic growth in the population, mostly worldwide across this plane. And that's definitely another narrative that's worth investigating and definitely worth questioning for sure. What if there were major resets in the past that included population and not just maybe because of natural disasters, maybe because of like celestial recalibrations, but also maybe because of human deliberate, slaughter of people, or in the Jared Diamond kind of way, maybe just the extinction because of whatever happened in the natural phenomena in a sense. We're not really sure. I'm not a big fan of Jared Diamond, though, just putting it on the record, but I am aware of that, his research in that line of thinking, which is very mainstream, and you could probably get a a PhD in that line of thinking without any resistance from the establishment. So maybe that tells you a little a thing or two. I think it's interesting when where you think about Ukraine and that whole area. There are those scholars and commentators who would point that out as kind of Khazaria. So that is like the land where the Khazars, who became kind of like those who say they're Jews and are not Jews, originated from. And that whole area um, could also be a place for the repopulation of those who identify as Jews and a greater population. So, what could be going on there? It could be trying to hide some history. At the same time, it might be just it's an exercise in population reduction in preparation for greater Israel to migrate over there because we're seeing this whole it's weird that this whole consciousness of the evils of the state of Israel was so just suppressed. You could not talk about it, and you could not talk about the history of the terrorism, the subterfuge, the deception of those that were involved in the formation of the state of Israel, the continuation of it and perpetuation of it, stealing land, which continues to go on. That was pretty much verboten. You couldn't talk about involvement in 9/11. You couldn't talk about the USS Liberty. You go to anything concerning Israel now on something like YouTube, which is completely curated and kept in a certain a range of editorial commentary, and you'll see free America from APAC. You'll see Remember the USS Liberty. That's like music to my ears. I've been following these threads for ages, but at the same time, I wonder if Israel's kind of like targeted for destruction, which I don't want to see. I'm not a fan of that. I'm not a fan of the state of Israel. I don't think Israel really has a right to exist as an ethno state. And that's not the topic of today's discussion, but it does seem that, wow, this is weird. It's at the same time, there's the funding goes on, the arming goes on. People are allowed to talk about this, and it seems like Israel and Jews are being set up so that if something, God forbid, something really awful should happen in that area of the world, maybe that population is encouraged to move and settle in another area that's been decimated and depopulated, which would be the homeland of Khazaria, the actual homeland of the European Jews. What say thee about that, PJ?
I think that's a really good observation. And let's just remind our audience that we've made it through the midway point of 2025, the golden age, and we haven't seen the major shoe drop. Now, we've seen some peanuts thrown in the gallery, but we haven't seen the first real act of the big one. Now, something when in this series we talked about age to age and coast to coast, we could talk about the television drama happening on the West Coast that's currently being pumped through the mainstream media, and there's a lot of speculation I could put out there about that and all the green screen fakery and what's behind all that. But that being said, let me circle back to what you just talked about, and I think that's entirely plausible, especially for those people who are believers and have been conscripted to the idea that we're still waiting for some major Armageddon and the second coming and all that. Whereas many of us in the little season eschatology firmly believe that all that already happened. There's nothing to be waiting for, and maybe that is the next act to really kick off the faux Armageddon, and somehow maybe everything that Alice Bailey and others of her ilk were talking about, the great teacher coming, perhaps that's all part of the next big act and play that we'll see unfold. So if anyone was placing bets about the shoes to drop, if you had May or any time around that time frame, looks like you lost your bet. Maybe they're waiting until later this year for the big reveal. time will tell. But all that is to say that perhaps part of that story is hooking in the people who think that that country in the Middle East with the people with small hats is the real one from the Bible. I tend to think that isn't true. In fact, I think that the real Hebrew state was probably closer to what we call the continental US, and that's another rabbit hole that we could explore at some point, including the Red Sea, that in maps of California, when it was an island, was actually called the Red Sea, pyramids all over the US. There's so much to unpack there, and perhaps that was part of this. For maybe some of our listeners would sound completely preposterous, but if you think about the Pangea that perhaps really did exist, and Armageddon splitting everything into continents and large seas in between, if everything was much closer, then that becomes a lot more plausible prior to Armageddon type of destruction, earthquakes, etc. So I think what you're saying about this all setting up something related to that part of the Middle East could be part of a larger plan to get people thinking that something not only historically but biblically is happening, and to pull a lot of people into Gog and Magog could actually be part of the reality. This is me wildly speculating. I have very little evidence for any of it, but that's just part of why we're here, and would love to get our audience's thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, there's so much that I could comment on, but I wanted to get your take on your own recent travels. And you mentioned the coast to coast aspect, and you're not based on the East Coast, but you've traveled there quite a bit, and you were there recently celebrating a milestone in your life. We will keep that a secret because you look not a day over 30, so we'll keep it there. And yeah, what struck you on those travels that led you to propose the topic of at least the coast to coast aspect of this discussion?
Yeah, yeah. Well, as you alluded to, I spent some time in New York City and celebrating a milestone, as you mentioned, and certainly I made a lot of mental notes about kind of the messaging that was all over the city in various places, and really priming people for a lot of the social agendas that have already been kicked off and are to come. And I have to admit that I did partake in some of the bread and circuses, including your favorite team, the New York Mets. Was a good time. You know, I did it. I'm gonna own it. But one of the things that really struck me in the course of entertainment, and this is how they always get you. You know, they get you entertaining. They get your guard down, you get into kind of a relaxed state, and your critical thinking takes a back seat in many cases. And one of the things that we had done while we were there is saw the musical production of Great Gatsby, which, you know, it was brilliant. Great performers, great stage, all of that. But there were definitely some themes running through that I'm not sure most of the audience picked up on. And it was really, from my point of view, pushing hard the agenda of men versus women, that women were so oppressed, and you know, it was like a empowerment sort of message. And on one hand, it's easy at face value to say, well, people should be equal, and to that I generally agree, although I do think that there's a family structure that we've been given, and everyone has their role in that. But that being said, I felt like there was an air of division that was underlying a lot of that, getting us versus them. And I feel like that ties to what's going on the other coast in the US, that I feel like that's also part of a division tactic. And I'm sure that there's more involved in all of that. I I would also direct people to look up a Substack author named Conspiracy Sarah, who recently had visited LA and gave her accounts of nothing happening there. And look in the comments section, you'll see people discussing a lot of green screen fakery. And it just, to me, I always go back to when people are kind of agitated and made to go against each other and fight each other, then it's really, you need to ask the question, okay, so what's actually being hidden right now? What are the controllers wanting to do behind the scenes while everyone's fighting each other? And I think that my example of the musical and then what's going on now are very much the same, that there's this theme of people fighting each other, and when people fight each other, then they're giving up their power to, one, be united, and two, push back against these agendas and live more freely. So that's where I'll hand it back to you for some comments.
I really love that you touched on that antagonism that we're always fed, and it compels us to pick a side. And as mammals, we're pack animals. We have that tendency to pick sides and end up in tribes. And I'm sure historically it was necessary when you didn't know the people from the other side of the valley to circle the wagons and to maybe put a wall around your fields. And then you had your hunting territories and stuff like that. So I don't really question that part of history or the evolution of our human society. So that is often exploited when we're just living our lives and getting along in the world, and we're almost always expected, if not forced, to pick a side. And you can see that in our bread and circuses. In Boston Strong, they literally call them like nation, right? Like Yankees Nation, Boston Red Sox Nation, things like that. No one ever said Mets Nation. I don't know why, but I want to be the governor of Mets Nation one of these days. And so we're constantly compelled to take these sides. And so even if we're given some kind of event, if that's the topic and we don't have an interest in it, we find ourselves compelled to take a side. Now, getting into the current situation on the left coast, I find it interesting that if there's a lot of green screen involved, if there's really not that the big scale, and that it's kind of like crisis actors, it's people paid to bust in or just useful idiots like Antifa that are mostly involved, they can't even put on a real race war.
We've seen, the ads put up on Craigslist offering people thousands of dollars a week to go out and conduct these violent and dangerous riots in the streets of not only Los Angeles, but we saw earlier in Chicago and New York and other cities across the country.
That's comforting to me. So if you step back a little bit and look at it from a more macro scale, and you realize that the tensions aren't as great as what we're presented to be, then it's kind of comforting in the sense that they can't even put on this kind of thing without their TV fakery, without putting things through a screen. So that's where I am on that, and I'm getting the same signals. I have a relative in LA, and they're not reporting on anything. It's just, oh yeah, I heard about it. Nothing much is going on, and that person is not exactly like someone we would consider in the same camp as us philosophically. Definitely very left leaning, and would probably jump all over it if they saw anything. But there's no word of that. It's just like life is going on in LA. But it does, the effect of that screen and what the talking heads are feeding people can be seen in everyday life and conversations as far afield as where I am and where you are. Just yesterday, I was interacting with somebody who we were on a certain job, and there were cleaners there, and they were Mexican. And so what happens? We needed them to hurry up because we had other things to do, but they were doing a really thorough job. They were good workers. But how it entered the conversation was the person who hired them said, I really hate to, put the screws down on Mexicans at this time of all times. It's like that can actually impact your behavior. You're not being a mean person if you just say, could you hurry up? It's not really that you don't have to do this thorough a job or whatever. Just have a conversation. But it was intimidating because, they're Mexicans. And then there's the assumption of where they come from, how they got here, all that kind of stuff. And they either do or don't belong here and all that. So it's more narratives, but that entered the conversation just because of that. Whatever is going on or not going on in LA at the moment, it's fed through the ether and it gets to us and it affects us in certain ways, depending on what we believe and what we consume.
Along those lines, I've heard that your part of the left coast has also supposedly been impacted by a lot of these governmental machinations. Have you personally seen any of that, or does that feel a lot like more TV narratives from your point of view?
I expected when things kind of blew up, at least the perception of things blowing up, happen in further south in LA. I expected something to happen in Oakland, at least the activist community, which is very strong. I figured they'd be going nuts around here. I haven't seen road closures. I haven't encountered anything going on. I haven't heard a peep. Things like the locals kind of social media, that conversation, I haven't seen anything. So, and not to say that they're not trying, and there are Antifa kind of those types around the Oakland area where I'm based, but no, I haven't heard a word or seen a speck of evidence that anything's going on here.
It harkens back to 2020 as a great example of a TV psyop that if everyone had just turned off their TV and looked around, they'd realize everyone was fine. No one was sick until they visited some sort of Rockefeller Medicine Institute. No one was dropping on the streets. And it's quite obvious some of those early videos from China where everything was staged and people were walking and keeling over. It just, I think it goes back to this idea of discernment that we brought up before, as well as where you're paying your attention. And so many people in 2020 were glued to their TVs and then on Zooms talking about what was happening on their TVs and giving away their consent and their freedom for largely a TV fictional story that didn't get real until people took remdesivir and got on ventilators and then put foreign substances into their bodies. That's where fatalities really started happening.
And they
But
tested for something that doesn't exist using a faulty test or a very cleverly designed test to give the illusion that there is something out there. Yeah.
and along the lines of testing too, I have to give a nod to Agent's latest post about RFID chips and the agenda there. It's a really fascinating, I think it's part 8 that he just published as of today that we're recording this, speaking of the V2K technology. And one extension of that is the goal that was stated shortly before 9/11, I believe. There was a famous producer who befriended one of the Rockefellers who spoke of
Aaron Russo.
things that, yeah, things that were to come. Thank you for helping me out there. And basically, in that conversation that you can see in that Substack that I'm referring to, this person was like, well, why would you go through all this? What's the point? You already have all the money. And this particular Rockefeller said, well, the real goal is to get chips into everyone. And if you think about what happened with 2020 and getting everyone to put swabs up their nose, I'm not saying that was the goal. I think there, just as in a war, there are many motivations and benefits from these campaigns, but I think that that potentially could have been one of the intended outcomes, because in today's day and age, how tiny can you make a chip that people wouldn't see? And the answer is micro level. Look at semiconductors and how small they've made chips. So would you really ever know if you put a swab up your nose that there was something on there? And so it's just something to think about, that with every stage reality, the reaction is real, the consequences are real. But if you choose to not pay your attention to that scripted reality, then you're not affected, or to the extent that you can use your power to say no.
That's a really good point. I think when I was in Europe, I was just very conscious of the vibe there. Just it was just more chill, and even in Germany, where in a typical American's mind, the Germans are so intense, they're so efficient, they're all about getting things done, and yeah, on a societal level, the Germans get stuff done. But Americans, it's kind of like getting back to the whole thing, like Americans are all about sex, and are they actually doing it? I don't know. Obviously, there's a few babies born every once in a while, but the Germans are just getting things done and they're being efficient. Meanwhile, Americans are like slaving away, inefficient in their work and stressed to no end. And what's going on here? Why is America so targeted with like the food? You don't see a lot of obese Europeans. They're eating the same cuisine that in America we're eating, but it's not as packaged, it's not as processed, and they have their laws against GMO and futzing with the ingredients. So it's fresher. I mean, my mind was blown. I also went to Greece. Just very simple Greek salad. Of course, you have a Greek salad in Greece, right? Mind blown how good it was. It was just fresh ingredients done right. And so if you eat that way in Europe, you're not going to end up with a Taco Bell butt. It's just they don't resort to the fast food, and they're doing just fine. Yeah, I was just blown away by that. So there's this chill compared to America where everybody's just on edge. We're kind of set against each other in our camps, in our tribes, in our nations, and in our ideological little silos, red versus blue, and all that. And like you said, if you just you have to declare to yourself, I do not consent. I will not go along with this malarkey. And then everything just, and I'm not saying just like, what was that? Timothy Leary, like just like check out from everything, get high and check out. You don't check out, but you kind of keep one eye on what's going on, but you don't get attached to it in a very Zen way. And you can live a much more fulfilling life and get a lot more done when you're not constantly stressed. And then if you're not constantly stressed and you're not falling ill, you're not going to go to the Rockefeller medicine as a way to get better. You're just going to be like, oh, I'm just having a bad day. I'll relax a little bit and I'll feel a little better. I don't know if you saw, both PJ and I are members of, he mentioned Agent 13, 17, 11, correct? Got the whole thing right. Agent 13, 17, 11 on Substack, one of our favorite writers, and he opened up a Signal group for members, so subscribers, paid subscribers to Agent 13, 17, 11. And I posted something there recently that really outlined exactly what is going on in our world. And that it was a ChatGPT question that I found from a YouTuber who is talking mostly about diet and lifestyle. But she said she put in the prompt that was, if you were the devil, how would you go about destroying a country? And ChatGPT was very quick with the answer, and it was just everything. It was the environmental stresses, the food, distract everybody, get them in front of a screen, get them inside, away from sunlight and fresh air. It just laid everything out, and that ties into what Aaron Russo was talking about and Nick Rockefeller wanting to put chips in. It just gets us away from our own nature, from the way God wanted us to live, and it just points towards this digital prison that we don't have to opt into if we are really conscious of it. And I think that's the shoe that's going to drop this year. Is basically, you've already seen the push to real ID. If you don't have it, then it's there are other means. There's always another option, in a way. Like when you go to the airport, you don't have to go into the Michael Chertoff naked body scanners. You can opt out, and they make it a pain in the ass, but you don't have to. So there's always ways. But if you look at it from a mainstream perspective, you don't see the options, just like you don't see options other than radiation and chemotherapy when you get cancer, because that's what people do.
Couldn't agree more. And just as a perhaps concluding comment before we wrap up this week's episode, I think about the more recent releases of kind of next gen AI. I don't remember what the acronym is. Maybe Jake, you remember, but it's really come online in, I would say, even the past month or two, that it's ramping, and we're seeing examples of that next level of AI sophistication. I don't believe that's a coincidence. We already have seen evidence that hologram technology exists, and it's been used for many years to perpetuate the UFO psyop. But what's really planned for the next shoe to drop? It's an open question, but certainly we've seen evidence where things look very real to people, like you could literally touch them. And what does that enable for whatever happens next? And it's just one more thing for people to think about when, whatever the next act of the play is, to say, this looks real on TV, but how real is it in fact? And even if I look out my window and it looks real, how real is it in fact? And what is it trying to motivate me to do? What is the end goal here? And I think that we're quickly approaching that territory where discernment will be so critical. And clearly we saw that in 2020. There were distinct camps in terms of how people participated and what it meant to their health or lives in general. And I think that was also a test run for what comes next. So that's kind of where I'd leave things for this week's episode, and certainly sets us up for future conversations in this mini-series we've started.
Yeah, I agree. That's a great stopping point. I had so many thoughts just racing in my mind about what to add to that, but I think this is a good stopping point. And we've touched on so much today. We've been all over the place, but it's cohesive in many ways. So before everything unravels, let's call it a day, and we'll hit you up on the next episode, which will be episode 24. I think we have a special guest next week, don't we?
In fact, we do. We have a couple guests coming in the next 2 weeks, and so bookmark in your mind what we talked about this particular episode. We'll revisit in a few weeks from now and carry on, and who knows what will have happened between today and then. Perhaps we'll have a lot more to talk about in the great psyop theater that we live in. But until then, stay safe, stay discerned, keep your head on a swivel, and we'll talk to you soon.
You just have to flood a country's public square with enough raw sewage. You just have to raise enough questions, spread enough dirt, plant enough conspiracy theorizing that citizens no longer know what to believe.